Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I never thought I would see something like that with my own eyes. I've been on several trips before, a few cruises here and there, but nothing ever prepared me for the night that boy disappeared over the edge. Even now, when I think about it, I can't help but picture the way the dark sea swallowed him up, how quick it happened, and how helpless I felt standing there. It doesn't feel like a memory, more like a nightmare that my mind keeps replaying because it doesn't know how to process it. But it was real. I know it was real. The trip had started out like any normal vacation. The cruise ship was massive, one of those floating cities with more levels and more restaurants than you could possibly use in a single week. I had booked it months before, eager for a break from the routine of work and noise back home. The ship was supposed to sail through a chain of islands, stopping at a few ports along the way, giving passengers plenty of time to wander, shop, drink, and waste away money before returning to the boat each evening. People go on these things for fun, for relaxation, for distraction. And for the first couple of days, that's exactly what it was. Pools packed with kids, older folks sitting in the shade with drinks, endless lines for the buffets. It was crowded but not unbearable. The first 2 nights I spent mostly exploring. I walked the decks, trying to learn the layout, because a ship that size is confusing in the beginning. Long hallways that looked identical, elevators that never seemed to stop where you wanted, staircases leading to areas that seemed closed off. I remember thinking about how strange it was that people could build something so large and send it floating into the middle of nowhere, and yet after a while you stop thinking of it as being at sea. It felt like a resort, anchored to nothing. On the 3rd evening, I decided to take a walk after dinner instead of sitting at the bar or watching one of the shows. The sky was dimming into a heavy orange glow, the sun dipping low behind the horizon. A lot of passengers were still outside, scattered along the open decks, some with cameras trying to catch the sunset, others with drinks in hand. I wanted air more than anything, to get away from the loud voices and constant chatter that filled every indoor space. The outer deck was wide, with railings high enough to make you feel safe, though you knew in the back of your mind that it wouldn't take much effort to get over them if you wanted to. I remember leaning on the railing, breathing in the damp salt smell of the ocean. The air felt different out there, cooler, quieter. The sound of the waves smashing against the hull below was steady, almost calming, like white noise. That's when I first noticed the boy. He couldn't have been older than 15, maybe 16 at most. He was standing not far from me, a few yards down, his hands gripping the railing tighter than I had ever seen anyone grip something. His knuckles were pale in the fading light. At first I didn't think much of it. Teenagers wander on cruises all the time, bored of their parents, just looking for space. But there was something about the way he leaned forward slightly, like he wasn't just looking at the water, he was studying it. I remember looking away, telling myself it wasn't my business. But when my eyes drifted back, his shoulders were rising and falling in a strange rhythm, like he was breathing too fast. His head turned slightly, but not toward me, more like he was checking the empty stretch of deck behind us. People were around, but not close. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet you get in pockets of the ship where the crowd hasn't gathered. And then it happened. It was fast, so fast I almost doubted my eyes. He climbed the railing. Not like someone fooling around, not like a kid trying to lean a little higher. No, he stepped up and swung one leg over in one motion, then the other, until his body was balanced on the outer edge. His fingers clutched the top rail for a second, maybe 2. I froze. My body didn't react the way it should have. I wanted to shout, to run, to grab him, but I didn't. I just froze and watched. He let go. I can still hear the sound, the faint slap of his shoes against metal as his weight shifted forward, and then the emptiness as he dropped. The splash was muffled by the size of the ship, the water so far below that it was barely more than a small disturbance in the vast black surface. I stood there, stunned, heart racing. For a moment I thought maybe he had grabbed something, maybe he was hanging on below the deck out of sight. But when I leaned over, gripping the railing so hard my palms ached, all I saw was open ocean. No head bobbing up, no arms flailing. Just endless rolling waves stretching in every direction. Panic rushed through me then. I turned, scanning the deck. A couple walking by a ways off glanced at me, but didn't seem to notice what had happened. I looked again, hoping maybe the boy's head would break the surface, that he'd start swimming, but nothing. Just black water, swallowing everything. My first thought was to yell, to scream for help, but the sound caught in my throat. I stumbled along the deck, trying to find someone in charge, some crew member. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a minute or two before I ran into a staff member near one of the staircases. My words came out jumbled, panicked, telling them someone had gone overboard. Their face went pale, but they reacted quickly, pulling a radio from their belt and shouting into it. The next half hour was chaos. Sirens I hadn't known existed began to wail through the ship, sharp announcements cutting through the evening calm. Passengers gathered in clusters, confused, whispering. Crew members rushed to their stations, scanning the waters, throwing out life rings, anything that might help. The ship slowed, engines rumbling down until the giant vessel seemed to crawl. Searchlights swept across the surface of the ocean, huge beams cutting through the night like pale blades. I stood there the whole time, trembling, watching the water. I knew what I had seen. I knew he had jumped. But the longer I stared, the more doubt crept in. The ocean was vast, black, endless. It swallowed him instantly, without trace. Was it possible I had been mistaken? That maybe it wasn't a person, that maybe I had imagined it? No. The image of his hands gripping the railing was burned into my mind. The way his body moved over the edge, the final drop, it was too real to be anything else. They searched for hours. The ship circled slowly, lights scanning every inch of water. I heard murmurs from the crowd, passengers speculating. Some said it must have been an accident, someone leaning too far. Others muttered darker things, about people who couldn't handle life anymore. Parents clutched their kids tighter. The air shifted from vacation bliss to heavy unease. Everyone knew what it meant. A person in open ocean, in the dark, with the size of those waves, it wasn't survival. It was only a matter of how long it would take before the sea finished what it started. The next morning, the ship docked at the nearest port and authorities boarded. Passengers whispered in hallways, speculating on who the boy had been, what family he belonged to, why he had done it. I didn't have answers. All I had was the image burned into my brain. I gave a statement, described what I had seen. They nodded, took notes, thanked me, but I could see the resignation in their eyes. They knew as well as I did that there would be no happy ending here. By the time we left port again, the atmosphere on the ship had changed completely. Smiles were forced, laughter quieter, the pools emptier. People avoided the railings, keeping children close. It was like a shadow hung over everything, a reminder that beneath the music and food and drinks, we were floating on something merciless. The ocean didn't care who you were. It didn't care if you were young, old, rich, poor. If you went into it, it took you. For the rest of that trip, I couldn't stop replaying it. The grip of his hands, the way he didn't hesitate. He had decided, and he had done it. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe if I had moved faster, if I had shouted sooner, if I had run to him instead of freezing, maybe I could have grabbed him, pulled him back. But I didn't. And now the boy was gone. When the cruise finally ended and we returned to shore, the news was already spreading. Articles online with vague headlines. Teen goes overboard on cruise ship. Search for missing passenger continues. No details, no answers, just fragments of information. His name was never officially released while I was watching the news, just a shadow of a person who no longer existed. Even now, back on land, I find myself hearing the ocean in my sleep. That steady crash of water against steel, followed by the silence after he disappeared. People talk about the beauty of the sea, about how freeing it feels to stand on the deck and look out at endless horizon. But for me, the sea will never be beautiful again. It will always be the place where I watch someone vanish, helpless, unable to do a thing to stop it. And the ending is simple, as much as it hurts to say. The boy never came back. No miracle rescue, no dramatic reappearance at another port. He jumped, he vanished, and he was gone. That's what the ocean does. It takes, and it doesn't give back. I still remember how cold that winter felt in Italy, even though it wasn't the kind of harsh Canadian winter I grew up with. The damp air of the countryside outside Rome carried a chill that seemed to settle into my bones. My husband and I had been living there for a few months already, since he had taken a contract for work. For me, it felt like a strange kind of homecoming because I was born there, just outside the city, and so many memories were tied to those streets, those fields, those stone buildings that never seemed to age. It should have felt comforting. It should have felt like home. But winter of 2020, nothing felt quite right. At first, it seemed normal enough. Italy was in its quiet season, before the tourists started to arrive in waves. The market still opened early, the cafes still smelled of fresh espresso and cornetti, and my family still gathered at my aunt's house for long meals that stretched on into the night. But little by little, we began to notice a shift in the air. News from the north carried whispers of something spreading, cases of some strange illness, entire towns closing their doors. I had family members working for Alitalia at the time, and they began calling us, warning us, telling us to be careful, telling us that flights were already being canceled. At first, I brushed it off. It all sounded so dramatic, and life in central Italy still moved at its steady rhythm. Nobody in the piazza was wearing masks. Nobody around us seemed overly concerned. It was too easy to believe things would stay that way. Our plan had been simple: stay until Easter, then fly back to Canada. In between, we had wanted to travel. We thought of Sicily first. It seemed perfect: mild weather, good food, and time to relax before going home. But family warned us against it. They said, what if they shut the island down? What if you get stuck there and can't leave? At the time, it sounded absurd. My husband and I laughed about it. How could they possibly shut an entire island down? It seemed unthinkable. So instead of Sicily, we booked a cruise. The MSC Grandiosa. It left from Civitavecchia, not far from where we were living, and it sounded like an easy escape. A week at sea, warm meals, entertainment, a chance to disconnect. We boarded on March 1st, 2020. The first few days felt like every other cruise I'd ever been on. The ship buzzed with life, families by the pool, couples lounging in the bars, kids running around with ice cream. Everything smelled of salt water and perfume. We fell into the rhythm quickly: long breakfasts, afternoons on the balcony, evenings in the restaurant. We had a yacht club balcony suite, and I remember standing outside, watching the sea stretch out endless and blue, thinking how lucky we were to be there. It wasn't until we tried to stop in Malta that something felt different. That day, the announcement came that the port was closed. They wouldn't let us in. No reason given, just closed. People grumbled. Some passengers shrugged it off. Others whispered about the news they had read, about countries closing borders, about the ship in Japan, the Princess cruise where people were trapped for weeks. We didn't really want to listen. It felt distant, like it couldn't touch us. Still, things started to change. The ship felt emptier. Every time we docked, more people left, fewer got on. By the time the middle of the week came, there were only about 800 passengers left. For a ship that size, it was eerie. Walking down the long hallways, past closed doors and empty lounges, felt almost like wandering a hotel after it had been evacuated. We were having such a good time that when the offer came to extend for another week, we jumped at it. It was so cheap, and the thought of staying in the comfort of our balcony suite, far from whatever chaos might be happening on land, was tempting. We signed the papers on Friday, March 6th, and they told us they'd have the final paperwork ready the next day. I remember leaving the desk that evening with a sense of relief. We thought we had made the smarter choice. The next day, the ship stopped in Genoa. That's when everything shifted. A friend of mine picked us up to go shopping at Serravalle Mall. It was supposed to be a fun day, but the moment we arrived, I knew something was off. People were walking around with masks, some flimsy paper ones, but others wore heavy-duty N95s. At that point, masks weren't common. Seeing so many of them in one place was unsettling. The mall itself was quiet, the kind of quiet you never expect in Italy on a Saturday. The energy was wrong. My friend spoke in hushed tones, telling us about rumors spreading through the city, about entire areas being closed off in the north, about hospitals filling up. She warned us that things were going to change fast. I didn't want to believe her. I nodded, I listened, but deep down, I thought she was exaggerating. Still, as we drove back through the silent streets of Genoa, past shuttered shops and empty sidewalks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around us. When we got back on the ship, we stopped by the desk again, just to make sure our extension was fine. The woman there smiled, but her voice trembled as she told us they might have to take the ship out of service. We could stay, she said, but it depended. She suggested we sleep on it. Something about the way she said it stuck with me. For the first time, I felt uneasy. That night, while we ate dinner in the nearly deserted restaurant, my phone buzzed. A message from a colleague at Air Canada. He warned me flights from Italy to Canada might be suspended soon. I stared at the screen for a long time, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. Suddenly, all the little pieces began to click together. The empty streets in Genoa, the masks, the thinning crowds on the ship, the nervous look on the woman's face at the desk. This wasn't just rumor. This was happening. We made our decision then. We would get off the ship. The next morning, we disembarked. The port felt strangely subdued. Even though it was a Sunday, there wasn't the usual chaos of crowds dragging luggage and taxis honking. It felt muted, like the city itself was holding its breath. We drove back to our house and began to pack. As I folded clothes and zipped suitcases, I felt this overwhelming heaviness, a sense that I was saying goodbye not just to a house, not just to family nearby, but to an entire chapter of my life. I had this sinking feeling that it would be a long, long time before I would set foot in Italy again. When we arrived at Fiumicino Airport, the reality hit me harder than ever. The place was nearly empty. Normally, the airport was a madhouse, lines at every check-in counter, people shouting, carts rattling across the floor. But that day it was silent. A few scattered travelers walked quickly, masks covering their faces. Entire rows of Alitalia planes sat parked outside, their engines quiet, their windows dark. It felt like stepping into the end of the world. We checked in, made our way through security with barely a pause, and sat at the gate. I looked around at the handful of passengers, each keeping their distance, each wearing the same uneasy expression. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. It was as if we were all waiting for something heavy to fall, something we couldn't name but could feel pressing in from all sides. When the plane finally lifted off the runway, I pressed my face to the window and watched Italy shrink below us. The fields, the hills, the coast, all of it faded into the distance. My chest ached as I thought about my family still there, about the empty streets I had seen, about the ship that was probably sailing into uncertainty. 3 days later, the MSC Grandiosa went out of service. Within 24 hours of our departure, the entire country shut down. Italy was locked inside, the first in the world to fall into that silence. Back in Canada, we watched the news in disbelief as weeks turned into months, then into a year before another direct flight from Italy landed again. Our photos from that trip sit in an album now, a strange record of a time when life shifted overnight. Pictures of sunny decks on the cruise ship, glasses of wine clinking, the sea stretching out forever. And then, just pages later, photos of empty terminals, silent gates, abandoned planes lined up like ghosts. Every time I look at them, I feel the same cold chill I felt in Genoa that day. The moment when I realized that something enormous, something unstoppable, was already here, and that we had just barely slipped out before the doors shut tight. We didn't know it at the time, but we had been standing on the edge of history, one foot in the old world, one foot in the new. And when we left Italy that day on that last flight, it was like closing a door behind us that would stay shut for a very long time. I never thought I would look back at that cruise and remember silence more than anything else. We had boarded Oasis in January 2019, excited for the usual kind of vacation people brag about. 7 nights, multiple ports, endless food, and the kind of manufactured joy that comes when thousands of strangers all agree to be trapped on a floating city together. The first couple of days felt like that. The energy was high, music playing, bartenders sliding cocktails across the counters, and people laughing in every hallway. But by the 3rd day, the mood shifted. It wasn't just a rumor, it was everywhere. Norovirus had spread through the ship, and it spread fast. It started quietly. You could hear whispers in the elevators, little complaints about people being sick, but that happens on cruises. The buffet line always carries the risk of too much food handled by too many hands. But then the whispers got louder. Staff began setting up sanitizer stations at every doorway, in every hallway, bottles strapped to carts like weapons. By that evening, announcements came over the loudspeakers, telling people to be mindful, to wash their hands more than usual. By the next morning, it was unavoidable. People were gone. Rooms closed up, hallways quieter. The crew stopped smiling the way they usually did. Their movements became sharper, faster, more purposeful. You could feel the fear. My husband got sick that day. It came on like a hammer. He said his stomach hurt, and within an hour he couldn't get out of bed. The ship's medical team instructed anyone with symptoms to stay isolated in their rooms. They delivered bland trays of rice and broth to our door. I stood there, staring at him under the sheets, pale and sweating, and I knew I couldn't stay locked in that room. I felt fine. Not a single ache. The rules said if you weren't sick, you were allowed to move around. So I left. Walking out into the hallway was strange, because I expected to run into people. On a ship that size, you always hear doors shutting, luggage wheels clattering, kids yelling down the corridors. But it was empty. Just the soft hum of the engines and the recycled air pushing through the vents. The carpeting muffled my footsteps. It didn't feel like a cruise ship anymore. It felt like a hotel in the middle of the ocean that had been evacuated without warning. The elevators were empty. When the doors opened on the main decks, the size of the emptiness hit me harder. Oasis was built for thousands of people, every corner designed for crowds. But the pool deck, normally a place where you couldn't walk 5 steps without brushing shoulders with strangers, was almost bare. A couple of stragglers in lounge chairs, wrapped in towels, their faces distant. Staff members moved with rags and spray bottles, wiping every surface over and over again. Railings, door handles, tabletops. Their hands were raw from sanitizer. Their eyes darted, like they didn't want to touch anything, but had to touch everything. The adults-only area was mine alone. That had never happened before. Normally you had to fight for a chair, elbow your way past groups. Now, I could pick any spot. The silence was heavy, broken only by the water in the pool lapping quietly against the edges. I sat down, but it felt wrong. It felt like trespassing in a place that had been abandoned. The emptiness pressed in from all sides. Every sound was louder, the shuffle of my sandals on the deck, the flap of a flag in the wind, the squeak of a crew member's shoe against the wet surface as they sprayed down the rails. I walked the entire ship that afternoon. The promenade, usually jammed with shoppers and people watching parades, was open. Most stores were closed, the lights dimmed inside them. The buffet, which normally held lines so long they curled around the room, had no line at all. Crew members stood behind the glass with plastic gloves on, scooping food out carefully, their faces tight with exhaustion. They served me like I was the last person they would see that day. I carried my tray to an empty table. The clatter of my fork on the plate echoed across the giant room. It was hard to eat. Every bite reminded me that somewhere down below, my husband couldn't keep anything in his stomach. By the 4th day, the ship was nearly silent. The captain announced that the last 2 ports had been canceled. We were heading back to Florida early. No one argued. No one wanted to get off in a foreign port anyway, not when sickness was everywhere. The idea of quarantine in another country terrified people more than being trapped on the ship itself. The hallways stayed deserted. Doors stayed shut. Even the people who felt fine seemed to hide. I kept moving, though. I couldn't stand the 4 walls of that cabin, the smell of sickness clinging to the sheets, the sound of my husband groaning. The strangest part wasn't the fear of getting sick. It was the way the ship lost its identity. A cruise ship without noise isn't a cruise ship. It's a hollow shell. You don't realize how much energy comes from people until they're gone. The music piped over the speakers still played sometimes, but it sounded faint, misplaced, like it was running on a loop no one remembered to turn off. The casino lights blinked, machines waiting, but no one sat at them. Rows of chairs faced stages that would stay dark. Whole sections of the ship felt frozen in time, waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. I passed crew members who avoided eye contact. Their hands were red, some with cracked skin, from constant sanitizing. They sprayed railings so often the smell of disinfectant stung the back of my throat. In the atrium, one man dragged a cart stacked with industrial bottles of sanitizer, so tall they wobbled when he turned. It was all mechanical. No smiles, no greetings, no forced cheerfulness. Just work. Clean, spray, wipe, repeat. The worst was night. Normally you would hear laughter in the bars, music pouring out of lounges, people staggering back to their cabins. Instead, it was only the ocean against the hull, and the faint creaks of the ship as it moved. I stood on the balcony once, looking out at the black water, and realized how trapped we were. Thousands of us locked inside a floating hotel, half of them sick, half of them scared. The sky was huge, stars scattered above, but it didn't feel freeing. It felt like the walls of a cage, invisible but solid. Every morning, announcements reminded us to stay in our cabins if we felt ill. The crew slid paper notes under the doors of quarantined passengers with instructions and numbers to call if symptoms worsened. Sometimes I saw trays left outside cabins, meals barely touched, drinks gone warm. Walking past those doors, I imagined the people inside curled on their beds, staring at the same 4 walls, counting hours until it ended. I hated myself for walking free, while my husband sweated through his fever alone. But I couldn't make myself go back inside for more than a few minutes at a time. By the 5th day, I stopped trying to enjoy the ship. There was no joy left in it. I only walked to avoid being in that room. The quiet had taken on a weight of its own. The ship felt wrong, like a building meant for life but stripped of it. I noticed details I never would have otherwise. The way the carpets absorbed sound completely, the metallic echo in stairwells, the way the air smelled more of chemicals than salt. I noticed how the sun glared off surfaces that no longer had bodies to soften them. Chairs stayed empty. Pools barely rippled. Hallways stretched on without interruption. When we finally docked back in Florida, there was no celebration. Just relief. People filed off slowly, pale faces, tired eyes. Families clutched their bags like they were fleeing instead of disembarking. The crew stood at the gangway with forced politeness, but I saw the exhaustion etched into their posture. My husband leaned on me, weak but upright, and we stepped onto solid ground like it was the first safe thing we had touched in a week. Looking back, I realized it wasn't just a trip ruined by illness. It was a glimpse of how fragile the illusion of safety is. One sickness tore through thousands of people and reduced a floating city to silence. It turned joy into fear, connection into isolation. I remember the emptiness more than anything else. The sight of entire decks meant for crowds left to echo with nothing but my footsteps. For days, I had a whole ship almost to myself, but it never felt like freedom. It felt like being stranded in the middle of the ocean, surrounded not by people, but by absence. When I think about that cruise now, the details are sharp. The sting of sanitizer in my nose. The way my shoes squeaked on freshly mopped floors. The echo of my fork in a deserted buffet hall. The flag snapping in the wind above an empty pool. The sound of my husband's shallow breathing when I finally forced myself back into the cabin at night. It was all real, every moment, and it left a mark. We had gone for escape, for luxury, for a week of forgetting the world. Instead, we came back with the memory of silence and sickness, a reminder of how quickly normal can dissolve. Even now, years later, I don't think of the beaches we missed or the shows that never played. I think of the ghostly version of a ship that should have been full of life. I think of the corridors lined with closed doors, the trays of untouched food, the endless smell of disinfectant. I think of how, in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by thousands of others, I had never felt so completely alone. I still think about that trip in 2004 more than I care to admit. It was supposed to be just another vacation, a cruise that would take us through warm waters, a handful of islands, and finally bring us back home rested, maybe a little sunburned, but with stories of beaches, buffets, and lazy afternoons. Nothing about it seemed like it would stick in my memory in the way it has, yet one small moment, one detail that didn't make sense, still plays in my head like a scratch I can't stop picking at. It was the night before we were set to head back, the evening that closes out a trip when you're both tired and wired, when the last night feels like it should be celebrated, but also carries the heaviness of knowing it's over. The ship had made its way back through the Bahamas, and that meant we had to go through customs. It wasn't the full ordeal you get in airports, but it was still a process. Everyone was supposed to present their cards. The cruise lines issued IDs that had our pictures and details tied to us. Those cards were everything on the ship. You needed them to get on and off, to pay for anything, to check in at ports, to prove you were who you were. Without the card, you weren't anyone. It had your face, your name, everything. Lose it, and you had problems. I remember walking into that customs area, the fluorescent lights buzzing slightly overhead, the tired lines of people shuffling forward. There was that mix of salt air clinging to us from the open deck and the sterile smell of the processing hall. Everyone had their passports and cruise cards ready, but the card was the main thing. It was supposed to be foolproof. They'd scan it, match it with your face, and you were either cleared or pulled aside. That was it. When it was my turn, I slid my card across, expecting a quick scan and wave through. And that's exactly what happened. No questions, no second look, nothing unusual. The officer barely looked at me. A green light blinked, my card was handed back, and I was waved on. Simple, quick, over in seconds. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I tucked the card back into my wallet, adjusted the strap of the bag on my shoulder, and waited for my travel group to finish. Once everyone was cleared, we walked out, the stress of the formality already fading into the background. That was how it always went. I didn't even remember the officer's face. They were just another part of the machine. Later that night, with all that behind us, we decided to spend the last hours of the trip in the bar. Everyone had the same idea, it seemed. The place was buzzing with people making the most of their final night, laughing too loud, drinking too much, clinging to the last stretch of freedom before we'd all be back at airports and jobs and routines. The bar was warm, dimly lit with low yellow lights, filled with the smell of liquor and sugary cocktails, sticky floors under the tables, music pumping through hidden speakers. The bartenders were moving fast, pouring, mixing, swiping cards. Every order meant handing over your cruise card. No cash, no tabs, just swipe and done. When I ordered my drink and handed mine over, I leaned against the counter, half distracted by the noise, the groups of people still in swimsuits with cover-ups, the couples dressed up just enough for pictures they might never print. The bartender came back, holding the card in his hand. He wasn't annoyed exactly, but his face was stiff in that way people look when something isn't right, but they're trying not to make it a big deal. He slid the card across to me and told me it wasn't mine. At first I thought I hadn't heard him right. I looked down at the card. The name wasn't mine. The face staring up from the glossy surface wasn't mine either. It was a woman. Not just any stranger, but someone I recognized. We'd met her earlier in the trip, her and her husband. They were one of those couples you sometimes click with on cruises, friendly, social, the type who didn't mind small talk at the pool or laughing with you at the buffet. We had made loose plans to meet up with them later that night anyway. Nothing set in stone, but one of those casual agreements that happen when you're all on the same floating island together. The card in front of me was hers. I knew it instantly. Her picture, her name. My chest tightened as I reached into my pocket and checked my wallet again. Sure enough, there was no other card there. The one I'd just handed over was the only one I had. Before I could even process it fully, they showed up. Her and her husband, smiling, waving, sliding into the bar area like it was all planned. The timing was eerie, as though they'd been summoned by the card itself. I told her about the mix-up, showed her the card in my hand. She reached into her purse, pulled out hers, and there it was, my card. The picture of me, my name, clean and clear. We stared at each other, then at the cards, and then back at each other. It didn't make sense. These weren't just casual plastic passes. They were tied directly to us, to our accounts, our faces. The photos were printed on them, scanned every time we left or re-entered the ship. They weren't interchangeable. Yet somehow, I had hers and she had mine. That detail stuck with me more than anything. The customs check earlier that day. I had gone through with her card, a card that had her face, not mine, and nobody had noticed. The officer had scanned it, looked at me, and waved me through without question. The system that was supposed to match a face to a name to a record had just let me walk right past. No alarms, no second look, nothing. We swapped cards back, each sliding the rightful one into our wallets, but the unease didn't leave. I remember holding mine tighter after that, checking it again and again, as though I expected it to change when I wasn't looking. It was mine, but the fact that it had been in her possession, and hers and mine, was a knot I couldn't untangle. The rest of the night played out as expected. Drinks, conversation, laughter, the slow closing of the trip. But I wasn't fully there anymore. I kept thinking about that scan, about the way the officer hadn't questioned it. I kept wondering if the machines really did anything at all, or if they were just for show. Did anyone actually check the photos? Did the system even have the ability to flag mismatches? Or did they just scan, see a green light, and move on without caring? The thought chilled me in a way I didn't admit to anyone at the time. If I could walk through on the wrong card, how many others had? How many people had been waved through on identities that weren't theirs? It made me think about what could have been done with that kind of slip. If someone had darker intentions, if someone had wanted to disappear into the crowd, or worse, to get somewhere they shouldn't be, it would have been easy. Too easy. I replayed the customs hall in my head, the hum of the lights, the shuffle of people, the speed at which everything moved. No one wanted delays. Maybe that was the point. Keep it quick, keep it smooth, don't make people angry. But the efficiency made it fragile. One wrong card, one careless glance, and the whole system showed its cracks. The trip ended, of course. We all went home, back to our routines. Life moved on. But I never forgot that moment. Every time I think back on it, the feeling is the same. The strange weight in my chest, the unease that comes from realizing something we all assume is solid and reliable might not be at all. That customs check, the card swap, the fact that I was cleared with a face that wasn't mine, it didn't break the trip, didn't ruin the vacation. It was just a detail, tucked between memories of sun and drinks and ocean air. But it was a detail that shouldn't have been possible, and yet it happened right in front of me. What stayed with me wasn't just the mix-up of the cards, but what it meant. Systems we think of as airtight are only as good as the people and machines running them, and sometimes both fail at once. I should have been stopped. She should have been stopped. Instead, we both walked through as if nothing was wrong, because nobody looked close enough to see that everything was. That night in the bar, when we finally swapped back, I held my card longer than I should have, feeling the weight of it like it was heavier than before. I remember pressing my thumb against my own picture, the laminate smooth and cold, as if I needed to prove to myself it really was mine again. It was, but the damage was done. I had crossed a line with someone else's face, and no one had noticed. It still unsettles me. Not because I think anyone meant harm, but because it showed me how thin the line really is between order and chaos. All it takes is one card in the wrong hand, one official too tired to care, one moment where the system doesn't do its job. That's all it takes. And once you've seen it happen, once you've been the one who slipped through, you can't forget it. I booked that cruise because I needed a break from everything. Work had been crushing me, and I thought being out on the ocean would give me some peace. I imagined long hours staring at the waves, losing myself in the horizon, enjoying the freedom of being away from my daily routine. At first, it was exactly what I wanted. The ship was huge, full of bright lights, endless hallways, polished floors that reflected the ceiling lamps, and the constant hum of engines underneath everything. The smell of food drifted from every direction: fried fish, grilled meats, baked bread, and it mixed with the salty air that crept in from the open decks. The first 2 days went smoothly. I stayed to myself, mostly. I'd wake up late, eat a big breakfast at the buffet, wander around the upper decks, sit in the lounge chairs by the pool, and read while other people splashed and drank cocktails. I didn't make friends, but I didn't need to. I wasn't on the cruise to socialize. I was there to feel small in the middle of the sea, away from the noise of everything else. It was the third evening when I noticed her. I was on the promenade deck, the one where you could walk laps around the ship and look straight out at the water. The sun was setting, and the sky was this deep orange that slowly melted into dark blue. I was leaning on the railing, staring at the horizon, when I felt someone nearby. Not unusual, people stopped and leaned all the time. But when I glanced to my right, she was there. An older woman, maybe mid-50s, standing closer than most strangers would. Her hair was gray at the roots, dyed a fading blonde toward the ends, and she wore a wide sun hat even though the light was fading. I didn't think much of it at first. People crowd each other on these ships without realizing. But when I walked a few steps down the deck, she moved too. Not fast, not obvious, just enough. I slowed down. She slowed down. When I finally stopped to tie my shoe, she stopped too, standing maybe 10 feet behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, so I kept walking, finished a lap around the deck, and went inside. I didn't look back. The next morning, I forgot about it. I had breakfast in the buffet area, a loud room with glass walls and clattering plates. I filled my tray with eggs, bacon, and toast, found a spot near the back, and settled in. Halfway through, I felt that same sensation, like I wasn't eating alone. When I lifted my head, I saw her again. She was 3 tables away, sitting by herself, a cup of coffee in front of her, her eyes fixed on me. Not a casual glance. She wasn't looking around the room. She was staring directly at me, unmoving, like she'd been watching for a while. I forced myself to keep eating, but every bite felt thick in my throat. I finished quickly and left, pretending not to notice. Maybe she was just strange. Maybe she stared at everyone. But she didn't. That day I tried to test it. I went to the pool deck, walked around the shops, sat by the theater, took random paths through the ship. Every so often, I'd see her again. Always a little behind me, always standing or sitting alone, always watching. Not once did I catch her talking to anyone else. I never saw her smile or frown. Just that blank, steady look. By afternoon, it was bothering me enough that I stayed in my cabin for a while. The cabin wasn't large, just a small rectangle with a bed against one wall, a desk, a chair, and a porthole showing nothing but waves. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it wasn't anything. Cruise ships carry thousands of people. You're bound to run into the same ones again and again. That's all it was. Still, I kept the door locked. That night, I tried to enjoy the dinner service. They sat me at a table with strangers, as they often do on cruises, and the waiters paraded around with trays of food. I was halfway through my meal when I felt my stomach twist. There she was again, 2 tables over. She wasn't eating. She wasn't even drinking. She was just sitting upright, her hands folded on the table, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I skipped dessert, excused myself, and left. When I turned down the long carpeted hallway that led toward the cabins, I glanced back. She was there too, walking at a steady pace behind me, her shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. I sped up. She sped up. That's when the panic started to hit. It was late enough that the hallways were mostly empty, just the low hum of the ship and the faint vibration under my feet. My heart raced, my palms sweating as I hurried toward my cabin. I didn't run, but I wanted to. When I reached my door, I shoved the card in, slipped inside, and slammed it shut. I pressed my ear against the door, and I swear I heard footsteps pause outside, then slowly fade away. That night, I barely slept. The cabin was too quiet. Every creak of the ship made me sit up. I kept picturing her face, blank and staring, only a few feet away in the hallway. The next day, I told myself I was done letting her ruin this. I stayed on crowded decks. I joined an excursion onshore, thinking I could lose her there. For hours it worked. I walked through narrow streets in a coastal town, ate lunch in a cafe, took photos near the docks. She wasn't there. The relief almost made me laugh. But when I got back on the ship, the first thing I saw as I entered the lobby was her. She was standing by the elevator, sun hat in her hand, her eyes locked on me the second I stepped inside. Like she'd been waiting. At that point, I couldn't pretend it was a coincidence. She was following me. The problem was, I didn't know what to do. I thought about telling someone, but what could I even say? A lady keeps staring at me? On a cruise full of strangers, it would sound like nothing. Maybe they'd even think I was harassing her. So I kept quiet, but I became hyper-aware of her. Every movement I made, every place I went, I searched for her face. And she was always there. Sometimes close, sometimes at a distance, but always watching. On the 5th night, I cracked. I couldn't sit in my cabin anymore, and I didn't want to run into her in the halls, so I went out on the outer deck late, when most people were asleep. The air was colder, the ocean black as ink. The sound of waves crashing against the hull filled the silence. I walked to the far end of the deck, near the railings, and stood there trying to breathe, telling myself I was imagining it. But when I turned my head, she was standing 20 feet away. The deck was empty except for us. She wasn't moving closer, but she didn't need to. She just stood there, her pale face half lit by the deck lights, staring straight at me. The sight of her in that quiet, open space made my skin crawl in a way I can't explain. I snapped. I walked quickly to the other side of the ship, down the stairs, through the corridors, taking random turns. I wanted to shake her. I wanted her gone. For a few minutes, it felt like it worked. I didn't see her anywhere. My chest loosened as I walked back toward my cabin. But when I reached my door and slid the keycard in, I glanced back down the hallway. She was there, standing at the far end, perfectly still, her eyes fixed on me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't safe on that ship. Not in crowds, not in my cabin, nowhere. She was going to keep following me, and I had no idea why. I couldn't sleep that night at all. I sat in the chair by the porthole, staring at the water, waiting for morning. By the time the ship docked again for the next excursion, I knew what I had to do. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't tell anyone. I just walked off the ship with the crowd, through the port, into the town, and I didn't look back. I bought a ticket for a ferry to the mainland, and from there a train. I abandoned the cruise entirely, leaving everything behind except my wallet and passport. I don't know what her deal was. I don't know if she was unstable, if she picked me at random, or if it was something else I'll never understand. All I know is that once I left that ship, I never saw her again, and I'll never step on a cruise ship for the rest of my life. Last summer, I went on a cruise that was supposed to take us around Iceland and Greenland. I had been looking forward to it for months. I wanted to see the landscapes, the fjords, the wildlife, and to feel what it was like to be in such a remote part of the world. I had never been anywhere like it before, and just the thought of traveling through places most people would never see in their lifetime gave me this strange mix of excitement and nervousness. The ship wasn't one of those massive floating cities you hear about. It was a bit smaller, the kind meant for people more interested in scenery and adventure than casinos and water slides. It felt just right. You could walk the decks and not feel overwhelmed by crowds, and every direction you looked gave you a view that didn't even look real. The air was cleaner and sharper than anything I was used to. Just standing outside on deck and breathing felt like some kind of experience on its own. We had gone through Iceland first. The scenery there was already otherworldly, with the black sand beaches, the steam rising from geothermal areas, and the sudden mountains rising from flat plains. But Greenland was different. It felt wilder, lonelier, like it was holding back secrets from us. When we pulled into port there, the place almost didn't look like it should exist on the same planet as home. A small cluster of brightly painted houses clung to the rocks by the water. Behind them were massive, dark mountains with patches of snow that didn't seem to melt even in summer. The water in the cove was calm, but there were pieces of ice drifting even there, some the size of cars. The captain announced that the weather outside the cove was going to be rough that night, too rough to safely head out. He told us we would stay anchored overnight and then leave at 6 in the morning, when it was supposed to calm down. Nobody seemed to mind. It was peaceful there, and knowing the ship was protected made it feel like a chance to rest before moving on. That night I went to sleep with the curtains open, just so I could see the faint light outside. Summer nights up there never got fully dark. There was always this dim glow, a soft gray light that made it feel like the day never really ended. I fell asleep staring at the land on the other side of the cove. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. Ships are never completely silent. There's always a hum of engines or the sound of water against the hull, but it felt almost unnervingly still. I checked the time and saw it was already past 8 in the morning. I thought we should have been long gone by then. Curious, I got out of bed and went straight to the window. What I saw made me pause. The same piece of land I had stared at the night before was still there, in the exact same place. At first, I thought maybe we hadn't left yet. Maybe there was another delay. But then I noticed something else. The water that had been mostly clear, except for a few drifting chunks of ice, was now crowded with white. The entire cove was choked with ice floes, packed so close together it almost looked like a frozen sheet in some places. It took me a second to understand what had happened. Overnight, the ice had moved in, drifting from outside the cove and pressing together until we were boxed in completely. The ship wasn't going anywhere. When I finally went out on deck, I realized just how strange it was to see. The ice wasn't just random chunks. Some were small, the size of dinner plates, bobbing up and down with the movement of the water. Others were massive, jagged slabs bigger than trucks. They scraped against each other with a low, grinding sound that echoed across the cove. Every so often, one would tilt and roll, sending smaller chunks tumbling into the water. The sound of cracking and splintering ice carried through the still air. People stood along the railings, staring. Cameras were out everywhere. It was one of those things you couldn't stop looking at, even if you tried. The ship sat motionless, anchored still, but now it wouldn't have mattered if the captain had wanted to move. There was no path out. The ice was pressed tight around us, with only narrow black seams of water weaving through it. Beyond the mouth of the cove, the horizon was nothing but more ice drifting endlessly, like a barrier stretching as far as I could see. It didn't feel dangerous, not really, because the ship was sturdy and the floes weren't moving violently. But there was something unsettling about being trapped like that, even if it was temporary. You couldn't help but think about how remote we were. This wasn't like being stuck in traffic somewhere. There was no quick fix. There was no road, no detour. Just endless cold water and ice. I walked the decks for hours, watching how the light shifted across the surface. The ice changed colors depending on the angle. Some of it looked bright white, some a dull gray, and some had this strange deep blue that made it look almost alive. Seabirds perched on the larger pieces, resting before taking off again. Every now and then a seal's head would pop up from a dark patch of water, curious for a moment before disappearing again. The whole place felt frozen in time. The captain eventually came on the loudspeaker and explained what had happened. Overnight, strong currents and winds had pushed ice into the cove in a way they hadn't seen in years. According to the records, it hadn't been that bad at this time of year in at least a decade. The plan now was simple. Wait until the ice shifted again, opening a channel wide enough for us to get out. He said it could be hours, maybe longer, but that there was no risk to the ship. Waiting gave me time to think. It was strange to be surrounded by something so beautiful and yet feel uneasy at the same time. The ice was mesmerizing, but I couldn't shake the thought of what it meant to be locked in by nature. We were completely at its mercy. The engines, the steel of the ship, the planning of schedules, all of it meant nothing compared to the slow drifting of ice. By early afternoon, you could see changes happening. At first it was subtle, just a few wider gaps between the floes. Then little by little, the whole mass began to shift. The grinding grew louder as pieces pressed and broke apart. Water opened into black streaks that stretched longer and wider. You could tell the current was finally carrying it out, the same way it had carried it in. When the ice started to clear near the mouth of the cove, the captain announced we would be leaving soon. The engines rumbled back to life, and the ship slowly began to move. Crew members stood watch, guiding the way as the hull slid carefully between drifting slabs. It felt tense, every scrape against the side sending vibrations through the floor, but we kept moving forward. Bit by bit, the cove opened up into wider water until suddenly the ice was behind us, and we were out in the open sea again. I stayed on deck as long as I could, watching the cove shrink into the distance. Even as the ship turned away, I could still see the ice pressing into it, as if it were closing up behind us. It was one of the most surreal mornings of my life. I had gone to bed expecting nothing more than another day on the schedule, and instead I woke up trapped in a cage of ice that hadn't been seen in years. It didn't matter that half the ports on the trip ended up canceled because of weather. That single morning made up for it. The memory of standing there, surrounded on all sides by silent, endless ice, is burned into me. It was the kind of experience you couldn't plan for, the kind that only happens when nature decides to remind you of its power. When I think back to that cruise now, that's the moment that stands out the most. Not the towns, not the tours, not the things we were supposed to see, but the morning the ice closed in and held us still. It was both unsettling and breathtaking, and it made the world feel bigger than I could have imagined. I'll never forget that trip, mostly because what started out as a carefree cruise with my wife turned into something I still think about at night, years later. We were in our late 60s, Canadian, finally taking the kind of vacation we used to only talk about during long winters. A Mediterranean cruise felt like the right kind of adventure. The thought of warm nights, good food, the sea stretching out forever. Well, it was enough to make us feel young again. We'd both earned it. Our kids were grown, grandkids were in school, and for once we had no responsibilities breathing down our necks. No phone calls in the middle of the night, no emergencies, no work deadlines. Just us, the ship, and the kind of days that seemed built to stretch on without any pressure. The ship itself was massive, like a floating city. There were so many bars, restaurants, lounges, stairwells, hallways, that at first I couldn't imagine ever feeling truly at home on it. But after a few days, the routine set in. Buffet breakfasts with too much food, afternoons by the pool or wandering in port towns, late dinners, and then drinks in the lounge or the disco, if we still had the energy. My wife was always the one with more energy. She never slowed down. She was a disco queen back in the 70s and still carried herself like someone who lived for the beat of music. She never lost her rhythm. We noticed the young Aussies pretty quickly. There were 3 couples, all newlyweds, all in their 20s. They were hard to miss, loud in the bars, tanning all day, laughing with the kind of careless energy that belongs to people who believe the world is theirs. They weren't unkind, not really, just noticeable. The kind of group that turned heads because they filled the air around them with noise and movement. But there was one among them that stood out even more. The husband of one of the women, dark hair, cocky walk, a grin that never looked like it reached his eyes. He had that air about him that said he liked trouble, maybe even needed it. The others laughed with him, but you could tell they also kept him in check, maybe without realizing it. I knew the type. The one who drinks a little harder, pushes things a little further, looks for the line just to see if he can cross it. We saw them often, at the pool, at the late-night bars, in the dining room. Sometimes we ended up near them, other times across the room, but they were part of the fabric of that cruise, like background characters in a play. You learn the habits of people you see every day, even if you never speak to them. It was one of those late nights at the disco when things shifted. My wife and I had already been drinking more than usual, carried away by the music, the lights, the fact that we didn't have to worry about waking up early. She loved to dance, and when she loved something, I followed. We'd been moving together for a while when out of nowhere, the cocky Aussie cut in. Not a word, not a look at me, just stepped between us and took her hand like he had every right to. I froze. It wasn't shock so much as calculation. I stood there for 2 seconds, weighing whether to make a scene, whether to confront him, whether to shrug it off. But then I thought, no way. I wasn't about to stand there like some old fool, while this kid thought he could just take what wasn't his. So I walked straight to his bride. She was standing nearby, looking uncomfortable but trying to hide it. I took her hand, nodded toward the floor, and led her right to where my wife and the bad boy were dancing. And then we really started moving. I'm not the dancer my wife is, but I can keep up when I have to. The look on my wife's face, half shock, half delight, told me everything. She nearly doubled over with laughter at the absurdity of it all. The song ended, and the Aussie grabbed his wife, storming off without a word. My wife and I kept dancing like nothing had happened. We both agreed later, quietly over drinks, that the young couple's marriage wasn't going to last. You could see the cracks already. But here's the part that sticks with me, the part that turned a funny story into something darker. After that night, I started noticing him more. Not just as one of the noisy group, but directly, personally. In the days that followed, I'd catch him watching us. Not long stares, not obvious glares, but quick glances that always seemed to land on me. In the breakfast hall, by the pool, walking down one of those endless carpeted hallways. You name it, I'd see him. And the thing is, he never looked away. Most people, when you catch them staring, glance down, pretend they weren't. He didn't. He held it, just long enough to make my chest tighten. My wife brushed it off. She said I was reading into it, that I was letting one silly moment in the disco get into my head. And maybe I was. But at night, lying in our cabin, the quiet of the ship all around us, I kept replaying the way his jaw tightened when I danced with his wife. A cruise ship is both huge and small at the same time. It's big enough to feel like a city, but closed off in a way that makes every encounter heavier. You can't leave. You can't escape the possibility of running into someone again. And every hallway, every stairwell, every elevator feels like a place where something could happen if someone wanted it to. One night, after a late dinner, we took a walk on one of the quieter decks. The kind with lifeboats hanging above and just enough light to see the railing against the water. The sea was black, stretching out forever, and the air smelled of salt and fuel. We walked slowly, holding hands, my wife humming some old song under her breath. And then I heard footsteps behind us. Not close at first, but steady following. I looked back and saw him. Alone. Hands in his pockets, head down slightly, but I knew it was him. My stomach dropped. We slowed our pace, and he slowed his. We sped up, and so did he. The deck was long, but empty, just the three of us moving in rhythm. I whispered to my wife to keep walking, to head toward the brighter part near the main lounge entrance. I didn't want to spook her, but I also didn't want to stop. Every step felt like it echoed too loud, like the ship itself was amplifying the sound. When we finally reached the busier section, I glanced back again. He was gone. Just gone, like he'd slipped into the shadows or turned off into some stairwell. My wife laughed it off when I told her, but I didn't find it funny. The rest of the cruise was filled with small moments like that. I'd open our cabin door to head out and see him at the far end of the hall. I'd be ordering a drink at the bar and feel a presence behind me, only to find him standing too close. Once late at night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside our cabin, slow, deliberate, stopping right at our door before moving on. I never confronted him. Something about the way he carried himself told me it wouldn't end well. He wasn't the type to laugh it off, and I wasn't about to start a fight on a ship where there was nowhere to go. When the cruise ended, we disembarked with relief. The sun was bright, the dock busy, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe. We didn't see him or the other Aussies in the crowd. Maybe they left earlier, maybe later, I don't know. But here's the thing, I still think about him. Not just because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Nothing came of it. No confrontation, no words exchanged, no fight. Just looks, footsteps, the weight of someone's presence pressing down on you until you couldn't shake it. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the loud ones, the violent ones, the obvious threats. Sometimes it's the quiet shadow of someone who decides, for reasons you'll never understand, to make you their focus. And sometimes you never really know what they would have done if the chance had lined up just right. That cruise taught me that, and it's why I still wake in the night sometimes, half expecting to hear those footsteps outside my door again. I still remember the smell of salt and fuel mixed together when I first stepped onto that ship. It was hot in Tampa, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've even left the dock. I'd been hired on a contract to work in the spa. I was nervous but excited at the same time. Everyone always talks about cruise ship jobs like they're some kind of adventure, endless travel, new faces, an easy life surrounded by the sea. But that week was enough to teach me how quickly a dream can turn into something else. The wedding was the first big event I saw on board. They had the ceremony set up with decorations, flowers everywhere, music playing, champagne being carried around by the waiters in crisp white uniforms. The groom looked nervous, but you'd expect that. People chalk it up to cold feet, the weight of marriage, the crowd watching. Nothing seemed unusual at first. They smiled for the photos, the guests laughed and clinked glasses. It should have been a happy day. Later, people whispered about an argument, but I didn't see it. What I saw was the aftermath. Word traveled fast through crew hallways. One of the staff burst into the spa and said the groom had slit his wrists and gone overboard. Just like that. 1 minute he was on the deck with everyone cheering him. The next he was gone into the black water. They said he'd done it right after the reception, that he walked away from the table, calm as if going for air, and minutes later someone screamed when they saw him bleeding and climbing the railing. The ship kept moving forward like nothing had happened, but everyone on board knew. Security, officers, medical crew all running around, announcements being avoided, guests whispering. That was my first week. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of him climbing over and disappearing stuck in my head. The sea is endless when you look out at night, like falling into nothing. After that, I felt the ship differently. The long corridors, the low ceilings in crew areas, the metallic smell and hum of the engines, it all felt heavier. You can't get away from anything when you're out there. Once you're on board, you're trapped until the next port. That reality hit me harder than I expected. I made a few acquaintances in the crew bar and in the spa. One guy in particular, another crew member, seemed friendly at first. He'd chat with me between shifts, ask about where I was from, what I'd done before the ship. Nothing strange at first. One night, he offered to walk me back to my cabin. It seemed harmless. The ship's hallways could be confusing, and after long shifts, sometimes it felt safer not to walk alone. But when I got to my cabin door, he leaned in, insistent about coming inside. His tone changed, too pushy, too demanding. I told him no, tried to close the door, but he kept pressing his shoulder against it. I had to shove hard, using my whole body weight to slam it shut in his face. I locked it immediately. My heart was hammering, and I sat against the door for a long time before I dared to move. The next day, I avoided him completely. Not long later, I heard he raped another crew member. The news made me sick. All I could think was how close it had been, how easily that could have been me if I hadn't forced the door shut in time. But on a ship, rumors get brushed aside, and men like him keep working like nothing happened. That was when I started to realize the company didn't care about us the way they pretended. The calls started soon after. Late at night, the phone in our cabins would ring. At first, I thought it was a mistake, someone dialing wrong. But when I answered, it was always the same, heavy breathing, moaning, the sound of someone getting off on the other end. No words, no introductions, just that disgusting sound. It happened not just to me, but to a bunch of us girls in the spa. We complained, tried to report it, but management was useless. Eventually, someone traced it back to another crew member. That knowledge didn't help much. Knowing it was one of our own, walking the same halls, eating in the same mess, sleeping a few doors down from us, made my skin crawl. Every time I passed a man in uniform, I wondered if it was him. I tried to throw myself into work. Guests came and went, and I massaged, scrubbed, painted nails, smiled until my cheeks hurt. But even the spa wasn't safe. I remember one colleague working on a passenger. She was giving a foot massage, the kind we offered as a relaxation add-on. Out of nowhere, the man moaned, and before she realized what was happening, he came all over the sarong. She was frozen, horrified, humiliated. We all were. She cried later in the staff room, trying to scrub the stain out of the fabric before anyone noticed. Incidents like that weren't rare, but every time it chipped away at us. We were supposed to act professional, keep smiling, move on. There was no protection, no justice. Just the next shift, the next client. Not all the horror came from men, though. There was a couple on board, unforgettable in their nastiness. They used the spa too, storming in one afternoon, already red in the face from shouting at housekeeping. They were wheelchair users, rude beyond measure, snapping at staff, calling people names, throwing tantrums over small details. They acted like everything was a personal insult. Later, I overheard housekeeping whispering. Apparently, the couple was unhappy with the accessibility of their cabin. Instead of reporting it like normal people, they literally took a dump in the middle of the floor and left it there as some kind of protest. The staff had to clean it up, gagging through the mess. That level of disrespect was like nothing I'd seen before. It stuck with me more than I wanted it to. The ship was supposed to feel glamorous, but behind the scenes it was a maze of bad smells, cramped cabins, and crew tensions. The gossip, the rumors, the whispers in hallways after midnight, everything built up into this pressure you couldn't escape. The groom who killed himself, the rapist in the hallway, the moaning phone calls, the disgusting passengers, the filth left on the floor, it all blended together into this ugly reality that no brochure ever mentioned. Out at sea, surrounded by water and strangers, everything felt amplified. The walls closed in, the corridors stretched on endlessly, and the hum of the engines under your feet reminded you that you couldn't just walk away. I counted the days until my contract ended. Every night, I double-locked my door. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every time a male crew member spoke too close or lingered too long, I felt my stomach knot. It was survival day after day. The ship kept sailing, the guests kept smiling, but for the crew, there was no escape from what we saw and endured. When my contract finally ended, I left the ship in port and never looked back. I stepped onto land and felt like I could breathe again for the first time in months. The air smelled different, freer, even if it was just another city's dock with oil and salt and exhaust. I carried everything that happened with me, though. The faces, the screams, the moans over the phone, the slam of my door against that man's shoulder, the whisper about the girl who wasn't so lucky. It never really left me. People still talk about cruise ships like they're paradise on water. Sunsets, cocktails, buffets, pools. I smile politely and say nothing, because I know what it's like behind the scenes. I know how quickly paradise can rot, and I know how dangerous it is to be trapped on a floating city where escape is impossible and the ocean is waiting just beyond the railing.